Hello all, as you know by now, we're on the Cold War unit, 1945 to 1989, anywhere around there. Some people argue a little bit before, some people argue that it hasn't even ended yet. So, it's up for a bit of debate. So let's go ahead and talk about the Atlantic Charter. And it was 8 major points stating war and post-war goals. So this was going on during World War II. Some of the main points that we see here is self-determination by people around the world. So this also deals with possessions as well. So when we look at imperialistic possessions, Africa, Southeast Asia, etc., during the time of imperialism, that's kind of what it goes towards. Trade barriers should be removed, so we're talking about globalization here. We want to see tariffs removed, free trade back and forth. Remember the Smoot-Hawley tariff during the Depression. Some people would argue, or prior to the Depression, would argue that that helped create this worldwide depression. There's definitely more reasons than just that, but that is a factor that should be looked at. All people should be free of want and fear as a human right. Now, of course, this has not come to fruition as of yet, but it would be nice. Aggressor nations would be disarmed, and there should be a general disarmament after World War II. So if we're looking at Italy, Germany, Japan, yeah, those guys definitely disarmed. That's why Hitler came to power, or one of the reasons he was able to come to power is he was rearming the not just the population, but the country itself. So he was ignoring some of the sanctions put upon Germany during World War I. He decided to rearm anyways. They were doing their own things. Other nations were doing their own things. They really didn't kind of care what he was doing. They cared, but at the same time, they didn't want to put any effort into telling him, no, don't do that. But general disarmament also. So we're talking about ourselves, Soviets, Great Britain, France. If we're spending less money on the military, the better off we are, because we can put that into our country. Anything from infrastructure to helping the poor, feed the hungry, helping other nations. When we have extra resources, you can do a lot with that, of course. All right, Bretton Woods Monetary Conference. So this sets up the World Bank, which is still in existence today. So a bunch of wealthier nations came together. They decided upon where the gold standard should be set at. At this time anyways, $35 an ounce. I think today it's about $1,200 an ounce, give or take. It changes from day to day, year to year, but I believe it's around 1,200, somewhere around there, 1,211. So we set up or not just we, when I say we, not just our country, but we as in the World Bank, we set up the US dollar as far as exchange rates. So everybody knows what their currency is worth based upon the US dollar. So if you were to go to a currency exchange, even today, go to Mexico, for example, maybe you've been to Mexico, you'll see in different little banks the exchange rate as you cross the border. Now, the World Bank is set up to give loans to nations who are in need. You want to make sure that your neighbors are well off. If your neighbors aren't well off, well, it's going to hurt you also. So it's good. Remember, sharing is caring. All right, the Yalta Conference, February 1945. This is where the UN is going to be established. So there's a meeting of Winston Churchill. That's him there on the left. We have Roosevelt there in the middle and Joseph Stalin there on the right. Now, at this Yalta Conference, this is where Germany is divided up into 4 separate zones. One to be administrated by ourselves, Great Britain, France, and Stalin. Now, for the most part, we merge the French, English, and ours relatively quickly, because France and Great Britain, they don't really want to deal with it. They have their own issues. Remember, this is Europe. They were getting attacked by the Germans. They want to rebuild, restructure, fix their own countries. We set up free elections to be allowed in the states of Eastern Europe, so all those different countries / states that Hitler had taken over. So we want to have those people have some type of democratic rule in their country, and we set this up. So that's what's supposed to happen. Russia agrees to join the war against Japan in the Pacific Theater within 3 months after the Germans surrender. So after the Germans completely surrender, Russia goes ahead and agrees and says, hey, we'll help you out with Japan. So that could be an issue a little bit later on. We also have a Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, so a few months after that February 1945 date. And we see some agreements and disagreements here. Germany is to be disarmed. That's kind of what was set up in Yalta. Nazi Party disbanded and war criminals to be tried. This was a pretty long process and lasted a very long time. I believe all the way until the 1980s we were still finding Nazis in South America and trying them as war criminals. So this was pretty long lasting, these war crimes. Germany should pay some reparations. We learned a lesson during World War I. If you put too much into reparations and them having to pay, it's going to be difficult for them to, well, pay it off. So because it's difficult for them to pay it off, they're going to do something like get some crazy guy in charge named Hitler and rearm and try to take over the world. So yeah, you want to make sure that you don't put it so overbearing of reparations that the country cannot support itself. They're going to do something to make things work, and yeah, we got Hitler. Not a good thing. All right, some disagreements from the Potsdam Conference. Reunification of Germany. Stalin was pretty upset, and rightfully so, along with the rest of Russia. Nearly 20 million, some historians say more, some people say less, but around 20 million Russians died, both militarily, soldiers, and also civilians during World War II. So with that death toll, you can imagine Stalin and the people of Russia were not happy, and they wanted to punish Germany. So that's how we get East and West Germany. Stalin does not want to see a reunification of Germany, and this lasts quite a long time. Russia does manipulate elections in Poland, not only Poland, but some of the other Eastern Bloc countries that we'll talk about. And because they want them to veer more on the side of communism. They want this buffer zone that we'll talk about here shortly. Now, Truman, in comparison to Roosevelt, much more hostile towards communism, and Stalin himself. He did not want Russia, Truman, did not want Russia to take a part of the occupation of Japan. And think about it. If Stalin's not willing to reunify Germany, he's not going to be willing to reunify Japan as well. He's going to want his piece of the action. So that's what we see through Stalin. All right, we dropped the bomb on Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. This pretty much ends the war. I don't want to go into too great a detail there, but for the most part, because of the mass death toll and just the destructiveness of that bomb, the Japanese surrendered. So when we look at this is a timeline of notes. When we look at April 25th through the 26th, we see the United Nations formed in San Francisco by 50 nations. So very similar to the League of Nations. But the League of Nations, they didn't have teeth like the United Nations does. So the League of Nations was really dependent upon individual countries actually supporting the United Nations. On the other hand, demands forces from other countries to actually go in and quell any, I don't want to say uprisings, but any issues that we see in countries. Okay, July 6th, we dropped the first bomb. August 6th, we dropped that first bomb. Russia enters the war 2 days later, but the Japanese surrender on August 14th. So when Russia enters the war against Japan, they're only hitting China. They're not even getting towards Japan at all. They're still making their inroads, because think of that border right there. So they're making inroads over there in China, because Japan during World War II did have possession of large swaths of northern China. Next in our timeline of notes, we have the Lend-Lease Act terminated by Congress. The rule states specifically the Lend-Lease is only for wartime. So it's not for rebuilding, it's for ending the war, help end the war. So this is for munitions, this is for food, this is for money. So we do end up terminating the Lend-Lease. Now, the Allies still need aid to rebuild, particularly the Soviets, particularly Russia, because they got just so decimated by Hitler during the war. So Stalin requests $6 billion. Roosevelt refuses to approve it. Truman continues, and just the loan, it just dies. Okay, they just keep pushing it off, pushing it off, pushing it off, and it just kind of goes into no man's land. Congress instructs Truman, definitely do not use Lend-Lease for post-war construction, because that's not what it's for. It's for ending the war. So something else needs to happen in order for us to assist the countries of Europe. Germany signed surrender May 7th. Truman ends Lend-Lease 4 days later. So no more money for anybody, because the war in Europe anyways is over. Now we do see the Eastern Bloc being formed. So the Eastern Bloc are all these countries in Eastern Europe. See all right here? So the Eastern Bloc. So we got Germany, East Germany. This would be West Germany right here. If you notice, it's a little bit bigger than East Germany. The reason for it, because remember, this is all Great Britain, France, and ourselves controlling this area. So we went ahead and combined it right away. So you have this more light colored over here. Yugoslavia, they kind of have their own form of communism eventually, but these are going to all be communist countries. Russia, of course, they absorb all these areas right here as a part of the Soviet Union, thus the Soviet Union. Okay, just like we are the United States, so they absorb all these countries. Now these end up being separate countries outside of the actual USSR, but at the same time they're under the sphere of Soviet influence. So this is referred to the Eastern Bloc, this kind of pinkish color right here. So one of the reasons it is under that sphere, remember I was kind of hinting earlier that Stalin specifically wanted to make sure that these countries stayed in the sphere of the Soviets. They wanted a buffer zone, because if anyone ever attacked them, they would attack these countries before they would get to the Soviet Union. Okay, so this would be considered a buffer zone. Stalin 1946 speech, communism and capitalism cannot coexist. So he throws down the gauntlet and says you will end up being taken over by communists for the most part. Okay. He claims actions are necessary to protect the USSR from attack. So there we go. As far as that buffer zone, only communist Yugoslavia, not dominated by the USSR. So not exactly in line with the same type of communism as we see in the Soviet Union. If we look at China as well, so not exactly the same. If we look at other nations that decided to go the communist route, they have their own form, not like we see in the USSR. All right, some important events after the war in 1946. The Kennan telegram, the long telegram, also pronounced Kennan, depends on who you speak to. He's an American diplomat, very knowing of the way Russians mentality, the way they think. So when we look at his document, it really outlines this whole idea of containment and how we're going to work with the Soviets, what we're going to do in order to counteract communism. So it is an important document to understand. That's why we take time in going over it, and I really want you guys to understand what that document's all about. So his opinion, Soviet Union is just going to try to expand. That's kind of what communism is based upon too. If we look at some Communist Manifesto, etc., eventually communism will take over the world. Once that happens, you have utopia, because utopia is wonderful. Kennan recommended the policy of containment, and as time goes on, we're going to see more and more containing ways to contain communism. Winston Churchill, his famous speech, where we get this term of the Iron Curtain has been drawn. So nothing in, nothing out. thus the Iron Curtain.